Hello, this is Peter, and in this walkthrough, I'll show you what Azure DevOps Starter is. So in Azure, you can create all kinds of services to host your compute and storage, to do networking, and with that you can build solutions. If you know what you're looking for, you can dive right in. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're trying to find out what you can do, then Azure DevOps Starter may be a good idea. Azure DevOps Starter is available for a whole bunch of programming languages. So also, if you know what kind of compute service you want to use, but you're looking for an example application in a certain language, then DevOps Starter is also a good point to go with you. First, a disclaimer. Recently, there was a retirement announcement that in March 31, 2032, 2023, so next March, in 4.5 months, the service will be retired, which is a bit sad because I think this has some great qualities, and this is for a certain audience. As you can see, there's an Azure Developer CLI in development, and this is going to replace the DevOps Starter. Currently, it is at version 0.41, so it is getting there. I don't think it's comparable straight away to DevOps Starter yet, right? So for now, for the 4.5 months to come, feel free to use Azure DevOps Starter. I'll also make a video about the Azure Developer CLI because I played with it recently and it looks promising. So very interesting indeed. Okay, first, DevOps Starter. The wizard really says it all. So let's dive right in. Create a DevOps Starter. And here you are prompted with the programming language straight away, where you can see you can select .NET, Node, PHP, Java, Python, Ruby, and Go. So you can choose to build an application that you're going to deploy to your compute, depending on the language that you're looking for, right? For instance, you can do Java. And then the next step is framework, right? And so with Java, you get the options to do Spring or JSF. When I go back and do Node, for instance, I can choose Express, Simple Node, or Sail. An optional thing that some of the languages have is that you can add a database. So you can add a Cosmos DB if that's what you want. Or if you just want to have your compute with a programming language on it, which I used mostly, then you don't have to do a database. So for instance, I'll choose a simple Node.js app. And then in the third step, you'll choose the compute option. And in this case, for the Node simple app, I can choose to deploy to Kubernetes service, to a container with web app, or to use Node, just plain Node on a web app, or to build a Node function. And if you're not familiar with these services, the order I just explained them in share a bit about the abstraction, right? So I started off with the lower version in the stack, where you can say that Kubernetes service is something that is most closely to VMs. You're running containers, but you have those VMs in your machine. You could, if you wanted, SSH into them, and you will have to manage and patch all of those. When you go to web app for containers, that's already a bit closer to really using a platform as a service, right? Because then you're deploying the container on some compute infrastructure, and you'll talk about the notion of one VM or maybe the CPU and the memory. but you can't really SSH or RDP into those compute options. With Windows Web App, you don't even use a container, right? You just have your own node application that you deploy straight onto that abstraction of a VM. And we call this mostly the traditional platform as a service, you could say. And then the highest abstraction is called a function, where you don't even talk about CPU and memory, you just deploy the function. And depending on your platform or on the configuration options of the platform, you can still decide to influence CPU and memory, but you can also just have just run this function. I don't care. Right, so you could go to the Kubernetes service. You'll have to authorize GitHub, because what the application or what DevOps Starter also does is it creates the infrastructure as code for your compute option and the code for your application, puts it in GitHub or Azure DevOps, depending on what you'd like to use. In this case, I've chosen GitHub. And then have a CI/CD pipeline. So for GitHub, that's a GitHub action to actually run and deploy to create that stuff. So you can authorize your GitHub environment. And then in there, you define GitHub things, right? Like an organization, like a repository, like the subscription you want to deploy to, the Azure subscription in this case. You can use an existing cluster or a new one. If you create a new one, you can specify the new one or use existing, and then there's additional things. The way this looks with a container app is a bit different, right? Because you don't talk about a cluster here, you just have the app service behind Azure Web Apps websites. As you can see, that's where you still see the specs for the compute that's running. And a function, you also have Azure websites, so you realize that functions actually runs on web apps, but you speak about a consumption plan here. So you just pay per use, pay per execution time for that function, and not have the full instance of that CPU and memory running for you dedicated all the time. So you can do that. And what happens is that you, for instance, do a node DevOps Starter. And each time you browse to one of the instances, you have to authorize, because it could be a different credential that you're using, a different GitHub organization or repo. And what you see here is the dashboard of the DevOps Starter, actually. So there's a repository, Peter Bruin, my alias, and then /node DOS. So that's the repo where the source code lives in, the infrastructure as code lives in, and the GitHub action. And then you also see the last time the workflow ran and it deployed, right? It built some tests, deploy, and run functional tests even. And you can see, so it ran to create the Node DevOps Starter app service instance, and it deployed the app to it. And there's even application insights to monitor the thing. Okay, what does that look like? So I'm just jumping to the same, to a different tab, but this is actually the GitHub repo that we were looking at just now. As you see, a couple of days ago, language, JavaScript, simple node on Azure Web App. There's some instructions on how to run, what it requires, etc. For you, the first time you run through the wizard just now, right? So you select that node, you select it simple, and then web app, and then deploy. Then it's going to create all of this for you. And you don't need to do other manual things, but you have all of it. So if you want to adjust or you want to troubleshoot, you can actually do that. So it uses ARM templates. See, so deploy to a Windows web app. Maybe that's what you want. Maybe it's not. You can adjust. We'll talk about ARM templates another time. If you're not familiar, in short, the ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager, and ARM is the API, how you can deploy things in Azure. You can do direct commands like Azure create something, but you can also describe the set of resources you want in the JSON file you just saw and submit that in one go to the Azure ARM API, and it's going to provision for you. And it has some consequences. It has the most advantages the most advantageous of using ARM templates is that you can keep on deploying the same template and it will just make sure that it becomes like that. Right? So it's really like a desired state. And you can do it over and over again. Here's the tests, and this is the application. So this is the Node app. There you go. And the workflow is interesting, obviously, because that's your pipeline. There's some environment variables. There's a build and run. And then there's a deploy. See for yourself. What you get then is a new resource group with an app service plan in this case, because that's what happens with an app service. And then you get an app service instance, and there's application insights. And on the app service, you'll see that there's a URL. If you click the URL, bam, you're there. So this is node.dos.azurewebsites.net. And this is where your Node app is running. And now you can adjust both the ARM template as well as the source code of your application. But in short, I think it's clear that if you want to get started with something, with a new project, just a hobby project or your full formal project, in any service and in any language, this is a great way to get started. As mentioned, this service is going to be retired in a couple of months. But for now, it's the thing. The other thing is still in development. So by all means, use this if you want to appeal to audiences, right, who use a certain compute service or who use a certain programming languages, because that's most important, right? If you're speaking to Java folks, show the Java thing. If you're speaking with Node folks, show the Node thing. Azure is a compute platform, so you can bring all the apps, but that's not appealing most of the time, right? People want to understand that you can run their application. Okay, so that was it. DevOps Starter, a great way to get started with any compute, any programming languages in Azure. Thanks for listening.